All right, welcome to this mini lecture on gospel music in Philadelphia. So, our goals today are to help you identify some facts about and characteristics of gospel music, and then we're going to compare and contrast two different gospel writers, both of whom have Philadelphia connections. Robert Lowry was born in Philadelphia, but then a lot of his career was either in the suburbs or eventually he moved to New York. And then Charles Tindley was born in Maryland, but eventually moved to Philadelphia, and that's where he made his career. So, the first thing to understand about gospel music is that we tend to think about it as the popular music genre that has evolved over the years with recording artists like Mahalia Jackson and Rosetta Tharpe. But actually, gospel music is a very broad term that can include any kind of Christian music, including hymns, ceremonial music, and the popular music that we now are kind of a little more familiar with. So we're going to focus on the earlier stuff before we get to the popular recording artists. We'll talk more about them in a later lesson. So where did this music come from? Well, it has its roots in European hymn music. So back in the 1500s, I'm sure you've heard about Martin Luther, the great Protestant Reformation guy, right? He had a lot of different complaints about the Catholic Church, which was at the time the Christian Church. You probably are familiar with his famous 95 Theses story. But Martin Luther was also very concerned about music. So at the time in the Catholic Church, the music that was heard was sung in Latin, no matter where in the world you were, and it was also a very complex music that trained singers would perform. It was polyphonic, so you've got these multiple different melody lines that only trained singers can really accomplish, and it was not very accessible to the common people who most of the time probably didn't even know what they were singing about. So Luther wanted to change this, and so he started writing what are called hymns. Hymns are simple to learn and sing. They're repetitive. They have the same music over and over, even though the lyrics or the verses would be different. You also have some distinct musical characteristics that I want to introduce to you. The first is conjunct motion or staircase motion, which means that the music tends to move from one note to an adjacent note. So if you're like looking at a piano keyboard, you can envision what moving from one note to an adjacent note looks like. But when you're singing, it sounds something like this. Up and down the staircase, right? Adjacent notes. There are some leaps for variety, but nothing too difficult that the average person wouldn't be able to handle. The other is that they're within an octave range. So this just means that they're not too high, they're not too low. They tend to stay within an 8-note octave range so that, again, untrained singers can sing them without any kind of special abilities. And then the textures are pretty simple, either monophonic, everyone singing the same thing at the same time, or some slightly more complex arrangements with homophonic texture, where you have some more trained singers perhaps singing harmony, or maybe you have an organ that's playing the harmony while the people are singing the melody. Gospel music, coming from this tradition with folks like Robert Lowry, who are basically expanding on the hymn tradition. So Lowry was born in 1826 and passes away in 1899. But before he does that, he publishes over 20 different collections of gospel music that he writes. He was born in Philadelphia, enters the Baptist ministry. One of his first placements is in Westchester, actually right in one of the Philadelphia suburbs. He eventually ends up in Brooklyn. And it's in Brooklyn, New York that he connects with music publishers and really kind of changes his main focus from preaching to writing and publishing hymn music. So that's really kind of how we remember him today, although in his time he was renowned as a preacher as well. His second collection of hymn songs, which was published in 1868, is called Gospel Melodies, which might be one of the first times this term appears in print in relation to these types of hymns. And he's best known for hymns like How Can I Keep From Singing, Shall We Gather at the River, and Nothing But the Blood of Jesus, all of which are actually still in circulation today and are often sung in different churches and Christian denominations. So Robert Lowry's gospel music has a couple characteristics that are common to other white gospel music writers of the time. First of all, the text tends to be based on conversion, this idea of giving your life over to Jesus and kind of having these transformative moments, things like that. He uses the diatonic major scale. This is another fancy music term, but really the simplest way to understand it is if you've ever seen The Sound of Music, the song Do-a-Deer, those notes do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do outline the diatonic major scale. So it's just a collection of notes And he uses those collection of notes to write his music. So do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, those A notes. The rhythms tend to be characterized by a predominance of quarter and dotted eighth notes, which if you're not a music major, don't worry about that too much. I'll show you an example on the next page. There's a two-part form, verse chorus, equal length. So we have here a section where there's verses where the music changes, and then a chorus or a refrain, which is the same thing over and over again. And sometimes this will be performed in what we call antiphonal style or call and response style. All this means is that maybe you would have a trained singer leading the audience or leading the congregation, excuse me, by singing the verse, or maybe the pastor or the minister would sing the verse, and then the congregation, the people, would sing the chorus part. So they would only have to memorize and remember that one part. They'd sing over and over again, and it would, the trained singer would be the one doing the verses. So here's one example of one of Lowry's hymns called Gather at the River. So on the left side, you see the different verses. On the right side, you have the chorus or the refrain that's repeated over and over in between each verse. You have, as you can see, the dominance of quarter notes. If you look here at the beginning, these are quarter notes, and these are the dotted eighth notes I was talking about. So you can just kind of visually see this pattern happening over and over and over again. In the music, happens over here as well, and you see this in a lot of his music. You have the equal length. We talked about musical meter and how you can divide the beat in songs into groups of 2, 3, or 4. This song, like many hymns, is in a quadruple meter, a 4-beat meter, and these little bars that are written here actually show those metrical divisions. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can see where those beat groupings happen with those bars. So if we're using those as a way to judge length, this top line up here would be either the right hand on the piano or the female singers in a 4-part choir. This lower part would be the left hand of the piano or the male singers in a choir, but these are happening simultaneously, okay? So this is one unit that's happening at the same time. So if we count the number of these units or measures or bars, all of those are synonyms, we can see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 bars in the verses, and there's the same number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in the chorus. Really, really common, this 8-bar phrase structure. All right, let's take a listen, and you can just hear how this music sounds when it's performed, and listen for some of those characteristics we mentioned on the previous slide. Okay, so now let's talk about the African American or Black gospel tradition as exemplified by Charles Tindley. So the origins come from a mixture of the European hymn tradition from Martin Luther, but also from the African American spiritual. So a spiritual is a genre that originated by enslaved Africans and African descendants in the United States as a result of what we call cultural erasure. Cultural erasure occurs whenever a dominant group, in this case European Americans, decides that they do not want another culture to keep their traditions, their religion, their language, and they force them to get rid of it. This happens in colonialism a lot, and it definitely happened with the enslaved people brought over from Africa. So they weren't allowed to speak their languages, they weren't allowed to practice their religious ceremonies, and for a while, they didn't really seem to care on the whole whether or not these enslaved Africans practiced any religion at all. But in the 1730s, this new force started called the Great Awakening, and this was a general trend of religious reinvigoration, I suppose, that was kind of going around. And as part of this bigger trend, one thing that people wanted to do was convert, whether forcibly or by encouragement, people who were currently enslaved and also freed Black people living in the United States. So you have this push toward conversion. Again, some people were being forcibly converted while they were still enslaved, others voluntarily converting. But you now have a whole bunch of Black Christians. And you also start seeing in the later part of the 1700s Black church communities popping up, including several important Black church congregations and communities in Philadelphia. And some of those are still around today, some of those congregations. So These songs, spiritual songs, began as monophonic songs, so just melody, that were eventually developed into these harmonized choral arrangements. Spirituals also allow for some flexibility, or what we call improvisation, and this tends to happen in the rhythm, in the melody, and sometimes even in the text. And so when this happens, it can result in heterophony if you have slightly different rhythms, slightly different melodies, or people changing the text up slightly. Let's listen to an example of this, and you'll hear this in the song Roll, Jordan, Roll. Okay, so now we get to meet Charles Tindley. Charles Tindley was born to a free mother and an enslaved father in Berlin, Maryland around 1851. His birth records are not quite clear, but that's the closest guess that we can get. So after the Civil War, Charles Tindley and his wife Daisy moved to Philadelphia. He becomes a pastor and he starts writing gospel songs that come out of the spiritual tradition mixed with the European hymn tradition. He was a very highly motivated learner. He was self-taught, and several of his hymns are still around today. You might know him from I'll Overcome Someday, By and By, and Stand By Me, which is not the 1961 Benny King version. So Tinley's gospel music differs from that of white composers like Robert Lowry in a couple of different ways. First of all, the text is not as much based on conversion, but on issues that were very important to Black Christians. So a big theme that comes up, and this is from the spiritual tradition, is this idea of worldly sorrow, but then the joys of the afterlife. So life is difficult now, but if we can just get through it, there's a better life in store waiting for us. Black gospel music tends to use the pentatonic or five-note scale instead of the diatonic major scale that composers like Robert Lowry used. So the pentatonic scale or five-note scale skips over some of those notes, and it sounds like this. So limiting yourself to those five notes instead of all eight. It gives it a different sound. One big example of a song that you might know that uses a pentatonic scale is Amazing Grace. That was actually not written by a Black composer. It was written by a white composer, but it was really adopted by Black Christian communities who just seem to really like that sound of the pentatonic scale because it then shows up in a lot of the music that they write. Tinley's music also allows for what we now call blues notes in the harmony. So these are notes that you wouldn't find in that scale that are slightly different to create a jazzier sound, for lack of a better word. And you'll see some of those in Tinley's music. So you either slightly raise or slightly lower a note from the note that you would expect it to be based on the scale. And that just gives it a little bit of an edge. It mixes up a little. And then lastly, the rhythm can be swung. So when we're talking about swinging the rhythm, this means that if it's written as something like bum, 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 if you swing it, it might be like da, 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 da. You kind of change up the rhythm from what's actually written on the page to make it a little more personal, a little bit more flexible, a little more fun. Mostly pentatonic with a couple of those slightly changed notes in there. One example of a blues note is over here on the upper right side with that note here, the E flat, which in the key that we're in, which is the key of F, would be the lowered seventh for those of you who know how to read music. So that's one of your bluesy notes there, giving it a slightly different edge. So let's take a listen to this and see if we can hear some of those characteristics that we mentioned on the other slide, and also consider how this music differs from Robert Lowry's example. Okay, that about wraps it up for this little mini lecture. Make sure you leave some good comments, and if you have any questions, be sure to ask those as well.